What's up, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of Story Dose. Today, we are reading Tolkien again, The Fellowship of the Ring. So the reason why I chose this today is because there's this really interesting moment that Tolkien has in this book that everyone glances over because it's not in the movies. And some people have called this the most boring part of the book, including myself, but it's also one of the best parts of the book because it has one of the best characters in the book named Tom Bombadil. Now, if you want to know more about Tom, you'll have to go check out my episode series on the Lord of the Rings that I'm doing right now. But what I want to do instead is read to you a passage out of the section with Tom Bombadil in two places. One where the hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, are in the old forest between the Shire and Breetown, a part that's completely cut out of the movies. I want to read to you a warning that Tom gives them, and he gets one sentence in about it. Tolkien gives us one sentence about this warning, and then he moves on until it becomes significant again. And even when it becomes significant, he actually doesn't directly relate back to the thing that he said 10 pages ago. He just sort of alludes to it by having the action take place in the exact opposite way of what he had warned him against. So, here we go. "Show me the precious ring," he said suddenly in the midst of the story. And Frodo, to his own astonishment, drew out the chain from his pocket and unfastened the ring, handed it at once to Tom. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment in his big, brown-skinned hand. Then suddenly he put it to his eye, and laughed. This is the One Ring. Frodo just handed Tom Bombadil the One Ring. And Tom laughed at it. For a second, the hobbits had a vision, both comical and alarming, of his bright blue eye gleaming through a circle of gold. What's that remind you of? Then Tom put the ring around the end of his little finger and held it up to the candlelight. For a moment, the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. Then they gasped. There was no sign of Tom disappearing. Tom laughed again, and then he spun the ring in the air, and it vanished with a flash. Frodo gave a cry, and Tom leaned forward and handed it back to him with a smile. Frodo looked at it closely and rather suspiciously, like one who had lent a trinket to a juggler. It was the same ring, or looked the same and weighed the same. For that ring had always seemed to Frodo to weigh strangely heavy in the hand, but something prompted him to make sure. He was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. He waited for an opportunity when the talk was going again, and Tom was telling an absurd story about badgers and their queer ways. Then he slipped the ring on. Merry turned towards him to say something and gave a start, and checked with an exclamation. Frodo was delighted, in a way. It was his own ring, all right, for Merry was staring blankly at his chair and obviously could not see him. He got up and crept quietly away from the fireside towards the outer door. "Hey there!" cried Tom, glancing towards him with a most seeing look in his shining eyes. "Hey, come, Frodo there. Where are you a-going? Tom Bombadil's not as blind as that yet. Take off your golden ring. Your hand's more fair without it. Come back, leave your game and sit down beside me. We must talk a while more and think about the morning. Tom must teach the right road and keep your feet from wandering." So now Tom has laughed at the ring twice. And he can see Frodo when he's invisible wearing the ring. And one of the times that Tom laughed at the ring is after he put the Ring of Power on, completely uncorrupted by its power. We talk about why on the Chad Garrett Show. Frodo laughed, trying to feel pleased, and taking off the ring, he came and sat down again. Tom now told them that he reckoned the sun would shine tomorrow, and it would be a glad morning, and setting out would be hopeful. But they would do well to start early, for weather in that country was a thing that even Tom could not be sure of for long, and it would change sometimes quicker than he could change his jacket. "I am no weathermaster," he said, "nor is aught that goes on two legs." By his advice, they decided to make nearly due north from his house, over the western and lower slopes of the downs. They might hope in that way to strike the east road in a day's journey and avoid the barrows. He told them not to be afraid, but to mind their own business. "Keep to the green grass. Don't you go a-meddling with old stone or cold whites, or prying in their houses, unless you be strong folk with hearts that never falter." He said this more than once, and he advised them to pass barrows on the west side if they chanced to stray near one. Then he taught them a rhyme to sing if they should by ill luck fall into any danger or difficulty the next day. Okay, so then you fast forward into the Barrow Downs piece. Frodo and the party are passing on the barrows. They are passing by the downs, and they have an opportunity to take lunch, but it happens to be in the shadow of one of the barrows. It's about noontime, and so they're wondering, well, it's hot, and if we take a rest on the east side, we might get some reprieve from the heat because of the shade of the obelisk that is like jutting out of the ground, these great stone obelisks that mark the barrows. So here we go. "Splendid," said Frodo. "If we make as good going this afternoon as we have done this morning, we shall have left the downs before the sun sets and be jogging on in search of a camping place." But even as he spoke, he turned his glance eastward, and he saw that on that side of the hills were higher and looked down upon them. And all those hills were crowned with green mounds, and on some were standing stones, pointing upwards like jagged teeth out of green gums. That view was somehow disquieting, so they turned from the sight and went down into the hollow circle. In the midst of it there stood a single stone, standing tall under the sun above, and at this hour casting no shadow. It was shapeless, and yet significant, like a landmark or a guarding finger, or more like a warning. But they were now hungry, and the sun was still at fearless noon, and so they set their backs against the east side of the stone. It was cool, and as if the sun had no power to warm it. And so there it is. But they were now hungry, and the sun was still at a fearless noon, so they set their backs against the east side of the stone. This is the only mention that they make. Tom actively warns them to pass by on the west side of each of these stones, and yet they just nonchalantly take their meal on the east side. It was cool, as if the sun had no power to warm it, but at that time this seemed pleasant. There they took food and drink and made as good a noon meal under the open sky as anyone could wish, for the food came from down under hill. Tom had provided them with plenty for the comfort of the day. Their ponies, unburdened, strayed upon the grass. And then he has a paragraph break here. And it says, "Riding over the hills and eating their fill, the warm sun and the scent of turf laying a little too long, stretching out their legs and looking at the sky above their noses, these things are, perhaps, enough to explain what happened. However that may be, they woke suddenly and uncomfortably from sleep they had never meant to take, and the standing stone was cold, and it cast a long pale shadow that stretched eastward over them. The sun was pale and watery yellow. It was gleaming through the mist just above the west wall of the hollow in which they lay. North, south, and east beyond the wall of the fog was thick and cold and white. The air was silent, heavy and chill. Their ponies were standing crowded together and their heads down. The hobbits sprang to their feet in alarm and ran to the western rim. They found that they were upon an island in the fog. Even as they looked out in dismay towards the setting sun, it sank before their eyes into a white sea, and the cold gray shadows sprang up in the east behind. The fog rolled up the walls and rose above them, and as it mounted, it bent over their heads until it became a roof. They were shut in a hall of mist whose central pillar was the standing stone. So, that is a piece that never made it into the movies, not even the extended editions. Tom Bombadil as a character never made it into the movies because they wouldn't have had enough time to explain him, or really, Tolkien doesn't even have enough time to explain him in the books. But if you want to know what happens next, you have to go and pick up your copy of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. The first installment, it is 2 books, technically, because the Lord of the Rings series is actually 6 books long. We talk about all that on the Chad Garrett Show. I'm ruining it for you. You have to go and watch it. Until next time, this has been Story Dose. See you next week.